A brief history of LGBTQ rights. The 2015 Supreme Court ruling made same-sex marriage a right nationwide. But for older LGBTQ people, certain basic human rights are a recent win. The path here was, and still is, fraught with a tug-of-war of ideology of what was thought of as human rights or what was just considered a joke. So for every Ellen,
I'm gay,
you got this guy.
I can't travel the country freely no more. I can't go to San Francisco. They got a 24-hour homo watch waiting for me in the airport.
So you got Scott Thompson.
Andrew Dice Clay is not the new Lenny Bruce. I am.
But then you get this genius.
They don't know if they want to be called gays, homosexuals, fairies. I call them.
So let's go back to see how we got here. 1933 to 1945, nearly 100,000 German homosexual men were rounded up and placed in concentration camps along with Jewish people. They were designated by a pink triangle on their clothing. In 1941, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, many U.S. citizens participated in the war effort, including gay men and lesbians. In 1948, the Kinsey Report was released, and it discussed male homosexuality. In 1950, U.S. Congress issues the report Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in Government. The report states that since homosexuality is a mental illness, homosexuals constitute security risks to the nation. 1952, Christine Jorgensen became one of the most famous transgender people when she underwent sex reassignment surgery. 1952, the American Psychiatric Association lists homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance that could be treated. Also in 1952, the U.S. Congress passed and Harry S. Truman signed into law the Immigration Act that barred aliens afflicted with psychiatric personality, epilepsy, or mental defect. Congress made clear that this was meant to include homosexuals and sex perverts. 1953, Executive Order 10450 issued by President Dwight D. Eisenhower banning homosexuals from working in the federal government, stating that they were a security risk. 1962, Illinois becomes the first state to decriminalize homosexual acts between two consenting adults in private. This is basically a sodomy law, which defines certain sexual acts as a crime. The precise sexual acts meant by the term sodomy are rarely spelled out by law, but are typically understood by courts to include any sexual act deemed to be unnatural or immoral. Generally, sodomy laws were only enforced for homosexuals. 1963, Baynard Rustin, an associate of Martin Luther King and a gay African-American man, helped organize the March on Washington that culminated with King's I Have a Dream speech. 1966, Compton's cafeteria riot, San Francisco. Transgender and drag queens in San Francisco reacted to ongoing harassment by the police force. The protests lasted for several days. 1969, the Stonewall riots in New York City. The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar in Greenwich Village in New York City. In response to an unprovoked police raid on an early Saturday morning, over 400 people, including gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and straight people, protested their treatment and pushed the police away from the area. Some level of rioting continued over the next 6 months, which closed the Stonewall Inn. The Stonewall riots became a pivotal, defining moment for gay rights. 1970, the first gay pride marches were held in multiple cities across the United States on the first anniversary of the Stonewall riots, including San Francisco and Los Angeles. 1973, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality as a mental disorder from the DSM. 1977, Anita Bryant, she forms Save Our Children to protest a Dade County, Florida ordinance preventing discrimination against homosexuals. 1977, Harvey Milk was elected county supervisor in San Francisco and becomes the third out elected public official in the United States.
Supervisor Harvey Milk have been shot and killed.
1978, Harvey Milk is assassinated. Supervisor Dan White is convicted of voluntary manslaughter and is sentenced to 7 years in prison, serving only 5. 1981, the AIDS epidemic begins. The U.S. Center for Disease Control reports the first case of a rare lung disease, which would be named AIDS the following year. 1985, Hollywood actor Rock Hudson dies of AIDS. Also 1985, the AIDS quilt concept was conceived and implemented. U.S. leaders remained largely silent and unresponsive to the health crisis. It wasn't until September of 1985, 4 years after the crisis began, that President Ronald Reagan first publicly mentioned AIDS. December 1st, 1988 was the first World AIDS Day. 1993, the U.S. Congress passed and Bill Clinton signed Don't Ask, Don't Tell that allowed gay and lesbian people to serve in the military. They would not be asked their sexual orientation during enlistment screening. 1997, Ellen DeGeneres came out as a lesbian during an interview on Oprah Winfrey and then became the first openly gay character on her TV show, Ellen. 1998, Matthew Shepard, a 21-year-old student at the University of Wyoming, was brutally attacked and tied to a fence in a field outside of Laramie, Wyoming, and left to die because he was gay. 2003, Lawrence versus Texas, ruled by a vote of 6-3 that Kansas law criminalizing gay or lesbian sex was unconstitutional, declaring the importance of constitutional liberty and privacy consistent with the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. 2008, Proposition 8 passes with a 52% yes vote in California, declaring that marriage is solely between a man and a woman. 2010, the U.S. Congress passed and President Barack Obama signed the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, so that gay and lesbian people could serve openly in the military. 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples by both the Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Since the start of AIDS in the early 1980s, a lifetime ban for gay men donating blood was implemented. In 2015, this rule was updated to allow gay men to donate blood as long as they've abstained from sex for 12 months. In 2020, the rule was updated again and allowed gay men to donate blood as long as they've abstained from sex for 3 months.
We both tested positive for COVID-19 pretty relatively early for Utah back in March. And people were asking at the time, oh, are you going to donate your blood or your plasma to be used to treat people? But we actually can't because we're gay men.
After recovering from COVID-19, I was turned away from donating my plasma on the basis of my sexual orientation.
It's very humiliating to be discriminated against publicly. It's awkward to have those conversations with your friends when everyone says, hey, let's go donate blood, and you have to say, oh, well, actually, I'm not allowed, and here's why.
It's especially frustrating now during the coronavirus is because I know that I'm somebody that's O negative and that I have the universal blood where I could just help anybody.
We were uniquely positioned at the time to donate our antibodies for research or potentially what now is a life-saving vaccine. And it was incredibly frustrating that we couldn't provide this resource because we're gay men.
FDA regulation that prohibits gay men from donating their blood based on a very outdated stereotype left over from the AIDS crisis, that all gay men are HIV positive and are easily going to spread it.
Even if this policy made sense at one point, it hasn't made sense for a very, very long time. You know, there have been changes in our ability to test in the past 40 years.
There's been huge strides to reduce the transmission of HIV in the gay community. Besides, gay men aren't the only ones who can even carry HIV. And then at the end of the day, all blood is tested for HIV and other diseases.
The weight of being told that simply because of who you are, you matter less, you are worth less, is impactful. When that message is then reinforced through public policy, it leaves a stain on who we are as a nation.
It's also a reminder of legal discrimination. Fortunately, it is increasingly rare that there's a categorical ban that says because of your identity, the government will not let you do this thing. But this is another one of those that's still on the books.
It's important that this regulation gets overturned because there's a huge proportion of people in this country that can't donate at such a critical time.
It's not just about the ability of gay men to donate blood. It's also about the ability of society to benefit from those donations.
This is something that affects a lot of Black and brown people, and I can't really help out my community because of these types of outdated restrictions.
In times of crisis, we are at our best when we are working together. I and others like me are here, ready and willing to help in a time of need. We just want to help.